It began gently, and I nearly ignored it. I had just bought an old Victorian in Asheville, North Carolina. Beautiful 28 Weaverville R&D with stained glass windows and complete gingerbread trim. Actually, given the location, a steal is reasonable. I didn't give much thought to the realtor. A frightened lady called Miss Periwinkle's description of the previous owners leaving abruptly as a family emergency. Having at last a place of my own delight, me too. The first few weeks were pure delight. My days were spent sorting, investigating the eccentric tiny stores around downtown, and just enjoying the peace and quiet mountain air. Still, the murmurs started to emerge. I originally imagined it as the wind whistling through the ancient window frames. Naturally, it was an old home. Chilly. But the murmurs continued even on silent evenings. Low, barely audible voices almost on the brink of hearing. Trying to decipher words, I would strain my hearing, but it was always simply a mess of unclear noises. "Hello?" I would half-joking, half-nervous shout out. Quietness. Things then began to flow. Little things initially. On the floor would be a book I had left on the coffee table. A chair veers slightly. I attributed it to my own inattention to the uneven flooring. Still, the murmurs became louder and more forceful, and the relocation became more urgent. I heard a clear bang from upstairs one evening while cooking supper and was singing along to the radio. My heart sprang up into my mouth. With my hands shaking, I grabbed a big iron skillet from the stove and crept up the stairs using only one weapon. My bedroom had generated the noise. I opened the door, skillet elevated, froze. There were clothing all over the floor and my dresser drawers opened. My jewelry box was tipped over on the carpet and its contents were all around. The rocking rocker in the corner, however, really bothered me. It was softly, methodically moving back and forth as if someone had just got up from it. "Who's there?" I cried, my voice almost a whisper. I heard just the chair creaking respond. I raced downstairs after backing out of the room and slammed the door closed. With fingers faltering over the keys, I grabbed my phone and dialed. 2 young cops, little older than I am, arrived. Top to bottom, they looked around the home, but came nowhere. There is no forced access and no indication of anybody else being there. They said I had left a window open, maybe allowing a raccoon in. I knew they believed I was exaggerating, worse, inventing things, or they disagreed with me. Nevertheless, I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. That evening, I did not fall asleep. Clutching a kitchen knife, I crouched on the living room couch, listening to the murmurs that now appeared to be emanating from within the walls. Now they were closer and more definite. I could practically make words clear. They gave the sound of names. I visited the nearby library early the next morning. I had to know about the background of the residents, as well as the family emergency Miss Periwinkle had discussed. I found ancient newspaper stories and property records with the librarian, a kind elderly lady with thick spectacles. As I read, my blood ran chilly. The home belonged to a long, terrible past. Over the years, many families had resided there, each had experienced tragedy. Mistakes, suicides, inexplicable vanishings. The stories mentioned unusual events, voices in the night, items moving on their own. In the 1920s, one report called the mansion the Whispering Walls. I realized quickly, the whispers constituted more than simply noises. Their voices were distinct. Trapped inside the house's walls, the voices of the dead individuals resounds across time, their misery reverberating back. They were not only shifting items either, they were attempting to interact. That day I got ready by packing. I said farewell to everything. I hardly told my landlord either. I left. I looked forward only. Years later, even today, I sometimes can hear the murmurs. Faint, far away, but definitely there. A sobering reminder of the home on Weaverville Road and its whispering walls' secrets. Story 2. From a late-night shift at the restaurant in Boise, Idaho, I was heading back. About 2 a.m, the road's empty and my old Ford truck hummed the only sound. Though my eyes were heavy and I was exhausted, I had a great distance of highway ahead of me until I arrived to my little apartment on the outskirts of town, close to Overland R&D. Driving, I looked in my rearview mirror, a behavior I had learned from my dad. I noticed him at that point. Perched by the side of the road, a guy was bathed in my headlights' faint illumination. He was tall and skinny, dressed in a black suit that appeared inappropriate given the rural location. But what drew my eye was his face. He was grinned, a broad, unsettling grin nearly ear to ear. I shuddered, a slithering of discomfort down my spine. It was just eerie. I sped forward, separating us somewhat. Still, a few minutes later I checked my mirror once again. He was still there, closer today, still radiant. In my chest, my heart started to hammer. He was keeping up with me? I was traveling at least 50 miles per hour. I turned back from the speedometer to the mirror. He was even closer. His grin appeared more predatory, more expansive. Panic wriggled at my throat. I ground the gas pedal, the engine howling as the vehicle shot ahead. I refused to dare check in the mirror once more. I just continued to drive, my hands white on the steering wheel, my gaze riveted ahead. It seemed like a lifetime, until at last I arrived on the outskirts of town. The lighting provided a little consolation, a sense of going back to civilization. I looked in the mirror, risking something. He disappeared. I drew over to the side of the road, inhaling shakily. My body wet with perspiration, my hands were shaking. I reminded myself I was exaggerating. It was just some eccentric hitchhiker. But my thoughts would not leave the picture of that guy laughing, his uncanny speed, the way he appeared to glide over the earth. I was driving home from work once again the next evening, using the same path. Nervous, I kept looking back in my reflection. Then I spotted him, once again from the side of the road. I'm smiling. This time I stopped not once. I maintained my speed. I continued driving, my foot firmly pressed on the accelerator pedal till I arrived to the security of my apartment. Not since have I seen him. Still, I find myself thinking about him, particularly late at night while driving. I routinely check my rearview mirror. A knot of anxiety starts to constrict my gut. And sometimes, in the brief reflection of a passing automobile, I see him, tall, slender, and grinning, always radiating happiness. Story 3. Growing up in a little hamlet in rural Pennsylvania, some distance from Scranton, nothing particularly noteworthy, just rows of similar homes and fields as far as the eye could see. Back then, we had just a few TV stations, and Channel 3 was always unique. Mostly displaying neighborhood announcements and the odd high school football game, it was a local access channel. Late at night, however, something unusual would occur after the termination of the planned broadcast. The screen would show only motionlessness. Not the typical white noise, but rather a whirling, throbbing grey akin to a storm cloud caught within the screen. The whispers would then also begin. Low, twisted sounds, muttering just under the stillness. Trying to decipher words, I would strain my hearing, but it was always nonsense. My parents advised me not to watch TV late, as it was just interference. But I found great fascination in it. Something about that static, about those murmurs, pulled me in. Sitting in the dark, captivated, I would see the whirling grey, and listened to the soft murmurs. I saw something in the motionlessness one evening. A shape. Originally vague, it became more obvious. It seemed to be a face, pale and thin with dark, sunken eyes. From the screen, it fixed me, its lips still as if it were trying to say something. In my hurry, I leaped back and toppled a light. The unexpected boom appeared to signal breaking off. The face disappeared, the stillness evaporated, and the screen darkened. I kept what I had witnessed under secretive to others. I knew they would not trust me. They would contend it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I knew what I had seen, however, and I knew I would never look at Channel 3 the same way once again. For many weeks after that, I avoided the channel. Should it turn on, I would turn it off right away. A knot of anxiety tightened in my gut. But finally, my curiosity overcame me. One evening, I was lured back to the stillness and to the whispers. I then once again noticed it. The face, more precisely this time, more defined. It was nearer, as if it were attempting to extend itself from the screen. Its eyes fixed on mine, then it started to grin coldly. Screaming, I turned away from the TV. Running to my parents' room, I woke them up with hysterical screaming. Their features marked with anxiety, they hurried into the living room. I gestured toward the TV and babbled about the face in the still image and whispered noises. They turned to face the TV. Nothing at all. Just the typical white noise. Telling me it was just a nasty dream, they attempted to cool me down. Still, I knew what I had seen. And I knew, down deep, something was very wrong. A few months later, we left the home. Although my parents never said why, I felt Channel 3 had some bearing on it. I never again saw the face. Still, sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I can hear the whispering. Faint, twisted, mumbling just under stillness. And I wonder what would have occurred if I had remained and allowed the face stretch out from the stillness into my world. Story 4. This occurred a few years ago as I was crossing nation from Los Angeles to New York City. Miles from any settlement, I was somewhere in Nevada on a long, barren section of Route 50. As the sun sank, the desert sky took on orange and purple tones. I saw him while trying to remain awake and listening to the radio. A young guy, thumb extending from his side of the road. He seemed neat, maybe college-aged, and had a rucksack over his shoulder. I faltered. Although my dad had always cautioned me against taking up hitchhikers, something about this child looked innocuous. And that was a long, alone journey. I stopped, and he slid into the passenger side. David introduced himself, and we spoke for some time. He said he was on his way to see his family in New York. He came off as a courteous, well-spoken, decent enough man. The talk veered into ghost tales as we traveled. David related a local myth of a hitchhiker who disappeared without a trace and left only his rucksack behind. I dismissed it as just a tale, laughing it off. David, nevertheless, claimed it was accurate. It occurred on this precise length of road, he claimed. I had a chill down my back. The scene was terrible and barren as the lowering light sent sweeping shadows over the desert. I peered at David. With an odd look on his face, he was peering out the window. "You okay?" I inquired. He looked at me, a slight grin flickering on his lips. "Just thinking about that hitchhiker," he said. A few minutes later, I had to stop for fuel. I drove into a tiny, empty petrol station. David disappeared while I was filling the tank. Looking around, he was nowhere to be seen. When I investigated inside the petrol station, it was vacant. I then observed it. David's rucksack was on my truck's passenger seat. I opened it, wary. Inside turned out a faded picture book. My heart beating in my chest, I turned the pages. David was seen in the pictures with his family at many ages. The final picture showed his thumb extended while seated on the side of the road, the identical stance he had been in when I grabbed him. I shut the CD hard, feeling like I could pass out. I rushed back into my vehicle and raced off, leaving the bag behind. I carried on driving till I arrived at the next town. David never crossed my path once again. Still, I find myself thinking about him, particularly if I'm traveling on a long, deserted road. And I often worry why he left his bag behind and what happened to him. Was he just a benign hitchhiker? And was he anything else? Story 5. Right outside Des Moines, on an Iowa farm, I grew up. Our land surrounded a large cornfield, its stalks rising like green giants above me. As a young child, I enjoyed playing in the cornfield, creating forts, and seeing myself as an adventurer in a deep jungle. But somewhere changed as I grew older. The cornfield began to have distinct sensations, less like to a playground and more like a presence. From among the stalks, I could hear murmurs, faint, rustling noises that seemed to trail me. Telling myself it was only the wind, I attempted to ignore them, but the voices continued. I was strolling home from a friend's house one summer evening and shortcut across the fields. As the sun sank, huge shadows stretched and twisted the rows of maize. The whispers were nearer than usual and louder. Though they were distorted, hazy, I could hardly hear words. Heart thumping in my chest, I accelerated. The whispers increased more intensity and loudness. Watching me, I sensed something hiding just outside my view, buried behind the thick stalks. One hand suddenly sprang out from the grain and grabbed my arm. With the stalks whirling into my face, I yelled, ripping my arm free, and ran across the field. I kept running till I arrived at the security of my home, closing the door behind me. When I informed my parents what had occurred, they discounted it as a prank, perhaps a wild animal. But I understood my own feelings. I knew something had touched me, not human. Following that, I never returned alone into the cornfield. I avoided even throughout the day. Every time I came too near, I felt terrible. Still, the murmurs became thinner now, more far off, a continual reminder of the invisible presence prowling the emerald depths. Years later, I heard tales from other residents of the town about unusual events in the cornfield, about whispers in the night, about brief views of something traveling between the stalks. Some said it reflected the attitude of a farmer who had passed away on the field years before. Others said it was something older, something always there, buried deep under the ground. I'm not sure what that was. Still, I understand it was true. I also know that the cornfield has secrets better left unaltered. Story 6. Right outside Des Moines, on an Iowa farm, I grew up. Our land surrounded a large cornfield, its stalks rising like green giants above me. As a young child, I enjoyed playing in the cornfield, creating forts, and seeing myself as an adventurer in a deep jungle. But somewhere changed as I grew older. The cornfield began to have distinct sensations, less like to a playground and more like a presence. From among the stalks, I could hear murmurs, faint, rustling noises that seemed to trail me. Telling myself it was only the wind, I attempted to ignore them, but the voices continued. I was strolling home from a friend's house one summer evening and shortcut across the fields. As the sun sank, huge shadows stretched and twisted the rows of maize. The whispers were nearer than usual and louder. Though they were distorted, hazy, I could hardly hear words. Heart thumping in my chest, I accelerated. The whispers increased more intensity and loudness. Watching me, I sensed something hiding just outside my view, buried behind the thick stalks. One hand suddenly sprang out from the grain and grabbed my arm. With the stalks whirling into my face, I yelled, ripping my arm free, and ran across the field. I kept running till I arrived at the security of my home, closing the door behind me. When I informed my parents what had occurred, they discounted it as a prank, perhaps a wild animal. But I understood my own feelings. I knew something had touched me, not human. Following that, I never returned alone into the cornfield. I avoided even throughout the day. Every time I came too near, I felt terrible. Still, the murmurs became thinner now, more far off, a continual reminder of the invisible presence prowling the emerald depths. Years later, I heard tales from other residents of the town about unusual events in the cornfield, about whispers in the night, about brief views of something traveling between the stalks. Some said it reflected the attitude of a farmer who had passed away on the field years before. Others said it was something older, something always there, buried deep under the ground. I'm not sure what that was. Still, I understand it was true. I also know that the cornfield has secrets better left unaltered. Story 7. On business travel, I was lodging at a little motel in Portland, Oregon. Though it was an ancient, somewhat run-down facility, it was quite priced and convenient to SW Broadway, the convention center. From my 5th-story room, I could see a bustling street. I slept nowhere the first night. I whirled around, the sounds of the city pouring through the flimsy walls. At last I stopped and walked to the window, thinking some fresh air would be beneficial. I noticed it at that point. One could see a face across the street in the window of a darkish building. A man's face, pale and thin, with sunken dark eyes. He was simply gazing, fixed squarely on me. My heart thumping in my chest, I stopped. I looked nowhere else. His hypnotic gaze captivated me. His staring seemed to be really strange. It was not just that he was gazing, it was the force behind his gaze. He seemed to be peering into my soul. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, I managed to look away. My body quivering, I staggered back from the window. I reassured myself, fatigued and seeing things, it was just my imagination. But I knew down below that it was true. Closing the blinds, I slipped back into bed and pulled the blankets over my head. Finally, I fell asleep, but dreams of the guy at the window, his empty eyes peering into mine, tormented me. I returned to the window the next morning, gingerly pulling aside the curtains. Though the structure across the street was still there, the window from where I had seen the face was vacant now. Searching for any indication of the guy, I searched around, but he was gone. Focusing on my task, I attempted to ignore it from my head. Still, the picture of the face in the window haunts me. The sensation of someone else watching me persisted, that those lifeless eyes still followed me. That evening, I struggled to get myself to gaze out the window. I tried to divert myself with work, keeping the drapes closed and the lights on. Still, the terror lingered, chewing at me. One day, earlier than intended, I checked out of the motel. Knowing that the person in the window may be watching me, I could not handle the idea of spending another night in that room. I never have returned to Portland. Still, sometimes I find myself thinking about the guy in the window. Why was he gazing at me? I wonder who he was. And I worry if he's still there, observing, waiting for his next victim. Story 8. Tucked away in a little overgrown park next to Cheeseman Park, there was an abandoned playground near my Denver, Colorado boyhood home. The merry-go-round crested menacingly in the breeze. The slide was chipped and faded. The swings were rusty. Children in the area whispered tales about the playground, claiming it was haunted and that unusual events occurred there after dark. Of course, I never thought the tales true. I was a doubtful child that questioned everything constantly. Still, I felt uncomfortable about the playground for some reason. Walking by it would frequently cause me a chilly spot. Sometimes, even in silence, I could hear light laughing emanating from the swings. I was heading home from a friend's house one evening via a shortcut across the park. The streetlights created long, spooky shadows as evening descended. I once again heard laughing as I passed the playground, this time clearer, closer. Their voices, high-pitched and joyous, sounded like children playing. My heart thumping in my chest, I halted. I looked across the playground into the night. The swings seemed to be being pushed back and forth. The merry-go-round was gradually whirling, its creaking enhanced in quiet. Driven by an overwhelming curiosity, I stepped forward. The laughing got louder and more forceful. Now I could see creatures moving amid the playground apparatus, dark shapes. Their shadows in the evening were little and vague, like those of toddlers. One of the individuals turned abruptly toward me. Its eyes black and sunken, its face pallid and thin. It grinned broadly and unnaturally, sending shivers down my spine. I cried and turned and ran as quickly as I could. I stopped only when I arrived at the security of my home, banging the door tightly behind me. I never returned near the closed playground. Still, the laughing persisted, although more far off now. A sobering recollection of the dark forms and the smiling face that tormented my early dreams. Years later, I learned that a new contemporary construction had replaced the playground. Still, I find myself thinking about the laughing in the dark, about the shadowy forms and the smiling face sometimes. And I wonder if they are still there, hiding someplace, waiting for another naive youngster to stray into their playground. Story 9? Story 9? The voice on the phone? Living alone in a modest Chicago, Illinois apartment in the Lincoln Park area, I awakened one night from my phone ringing. I checked the clock. 3:30 a.m. In my chest, my heart hammered. By this hour, who would be phoning? I picked up the phone warily. Whispers of hello in silence. A little murmur from the other side then. I lost clarity on the words. Hello, I said again, louder this time. The muttering persisted, a bit louder now, but still hardly clear. It sounded just like something else. Like a voice I'd heard before but unable to quite locate. Who is this? I requested. The whispering came to an end. Then a clear, shockingly near voice murmured my name. I dropped the phone, blood freezing. My heart hammering in my chest, I staggered back. I took another hold of my phone and looked at the caller ID. There was a blocked number. The remainder of the evening I did not sleep. Trying to identify it, I kept going back over the whisper in my head. The voice tormented me in familiarity. It seemed like someone I knew, someone nearby. The phone rang once again the following evening. 3 in morning. My fingers quivering, I fixed my gaze on the phone. Though I wanted not to respond, the need to find out who was phoning drove me in that direction. I took up the phone. Hello? I murmured, my voice hardly heard. The muttering began once again, louder this time, more forceful. I could almost hear the words. It sounded to be my name, being reiterated over and over again. Who is this? I started to cry. My voice sounded terrified. The whispers came to an end. The voice then softly said, I'm right behind you, clear and shockingly near. I yelled, flung the phone across the room. Heart thumping in my chest, I whirled around looking for someone standing there. Nevertheless, the flat was unoccupied. I dashed out the apartment, down the steps, and onto the street. I kept jogging till I arrived at a 24-hour restaurant. Its vibrant lights and busy environment provided some solace. I never visited my flat once again. I left the city packing my things and said farewell to everything. Sometimes I still find the voice on the phone, hauntingly whispering in my head. and I question who it was and what they expected of me. For my sake, hopefully, I never find out. Story 10. 10th story. The figure in the woods up in the Adirondack Mountains in New York State, close to Lake Placid. We once had a cottage in the woods. Perfect for escaping the city, it was a lovely, quiet place. As a young child, I liked swimming in the lake and wandering throughout the forest in summers. One part of the forest, however, I avoided always. Just beyond the boundary of our land, there was a dark, thick swath of woods. Saying it was hazardous and that individuals had vanished in there and never returned, my dad had advised me never to there. He termed it the Whispering Woods. Naturally an inquisitive child, I was attracted to the forbidden forest. Usually, standing at the brink of the woods, I would stare into the night and listen to the creaking branches and rustling leaves. Though I always convinced myself it was only the wind, I sometimes could hear tiny murmurs emanating from the woods. One day, I was further than I had ever been into exploring the woods close to the cottage. Realizing I had traveled too far, I was engrossed in my own world, chasing butterflies and gathering wildflowers. My heart sinking, I glanced around. I looked at nothing. I stayed at the Whispering Woods. Now the whispers were louder and nearer. Watching me, I sensed something hiding just outside my view, something buried amid the woods. Trying to find my way back, I began to walk, but the trees appeared to close in around me, the road meandering and turning me more into the forest. Then I noticed it. One person standing in the darkness between the trees. It was tall and thin, the shape was hidden by the darkness. It just watched me. It moved nothing. I stopped, blood flowing cold. Though I wanted to scream and go, terror immobilized me. Rising from the shadows, the figure stepped forward. Its face was clear now. Its eyes were black and sunken. It was pallid and skinny. It grinned broadly and unnaturally, sending shivers down my spine. At last I found my voice and yelled, turning and rushing heedless over the forest. I staggered and fell, scratching my knees and elbows, but I kept on. I continued running till at last I emerged from the forest and onto the well-known trail returning to the cottage. I never returned into the Whispering Woods. For years, the shadow form tormented me in recollection. Sometimes I still consider its pale face and lifeless eyes, about its terrible grin, and I wonder what it was and what it would have done had I not fled. Story 11. The backyard of my Charleston, South Carolina boyhood house included a large oak tree with gnarled fingers pointing upward. An ancient tire swing, its rope torn and faded, hung from one of the trees. That swing was fantastic. I would spend hours on it, swinging back and forth, picturing myself swooping over the skies. Still, the swing had an odd quality. Even in the absence of wind, I sometimes saw it moving on its own, softly back and fro. My parents would merely shrug and claim it was most likely just a breeze I hadn't felt when I asked about it. One night I woke up to an odd sound, like the swing swinging back and forth, a repetitive creaking sound. Heart thumping in my chest, I peered out the bedroom window. The swing was in motion, as if someone was seated on it, slow, rhythmically, but the swing had no weight. As the swing kept swinging back and forth, I gazed in frightened amazement. The night air creaked, a terrible contrast to the quiet of the sleeping planet. I found it impossible to look away. Frozen with terror, I waited there at the window till the first rays of morning painted the heavens pink and orange. The swing slowed progressively as the sun rose, its motion less noticeable until it stopped completely at last. I kept what I had witnessed under secretive to others. I knew they would not trust me. They would contend it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I knew what I had seen, however, and I knew I would never see the swing the same way once again. I avoided the swing after that. Every time I saw it, I felt terrible. Still, the creaking became fainter and more far off. An ongoing recollection of the empty swing that moved on its own in darkness. Years later, after I had moved away, I heard the oak tree had to be taken down when lightning damaged it. The swing went away. Still, I find myself thinking occasionally about the regular creaking in the night, about the empty swing swinging back and forth in the quiet darkness. And I want to know who or what was swinging on it that evening. Story 12. I was on seeing my San Francisco, California aunt. Her gorgeous old Victorian home in Pacific Heights has a big antique mirror in the hallway. I paused one evening, getting ready to go out for supper, to check my image in the mirror. I then saw something rather unusual. The meditation did not coincide with my motions. I lifted my hand, and the mirror lifted its own hand 2 seconds later. Blinking, the mirror blinked just as I had done. I inclined my head and the reflection did not move. In my chest, my heart hammered. I retreated, terror wide in my eyes. The mirror grinned slowly, a languid, eerie smile not reaching her eyes. It was like staring at a stranger, a warped form of myself. My breath seized in my throat as I staggered back. Mind racing, I turned and dashed out of the corridor. When I told my aunt what I had seen, she just chuckled and said I must be weary. She said the mirror was ancient and most likely had some glass flaws. Still, I knew what I had seen. The introspection had been different, not just delayed. Everything about its attitude and actions was incorrect. After that, I avoided the mirror because passing it made me uncomfortable. The impression that the reflection was still there, observing me, waiting for another opportunity to disclose itself, persisted. A few weeks later, I left San Francisco and came home. Though I attempted to forget the occurrence, the mismatched reflection stayed with me like a terrible reminder of the uncomfortable meeting with my own warped image. I wonder what I saw in that mirror still. Was it really an old glass fault, a trick of the light, or was it something else entirely? Anything like me, yet hardly me at all. Story 13. My granddad took a lot of pictures. Somewhere close to Zilker Park in Austin, Texas, he set up a dark room in his house's basement and spent hours down there processing his pictures. Capturing events in time that would otherwise be lost permanently, his albums brimmed with images of family, friends, and landscapes. I acquired his picture books when Dad died. I pored over them for hours, recalling the folks who were no longer with us and basking in the past. But when I perused the albums, I saw something unusual, as some of the images were vanishing. First, I assumed I was just misremembering, that I had seen the pictures previously but cannot locate them now. But then I began to see some pictures I knew were there, pictures with particular importance for me, disappearing without a trace. Especially one picture caught my attention. It showed me a little kid seated on my grandfather's lap, both of us grinning at the camera. I could still clearly see it. One of my favorites was it, but right now it was gone. The page it had been on was empty, as if the picture never had been. I began to become anxious. Searching for the lost pictures, I again looked over the albums, but they vanished from sight. They seemed to have been wiped from existence, deleted. When I questioned her relatives if they had seen the missing pictures, they all claimed not. They believed I was dreaming, that I was depressed, and that my memory was playing games with me. I knew what I had seen, however. The pictures really were accurate. They lived, and right now they were gone. I had dreams about the vanished pictures. I dream of the faces in the images slipping away, their grins turning into blank stares, their eyes empty voids. My heart thumping in my chest, I would wake up in a chilly sweatshirt. Unable to stand the idea of going through the picture albums one again, I finally stashed them. Sometimes I still find myself thinking of the lost pictures, of the faces gone, of the memories deleted. And I also wonder where they vanished to and why. Were they just lost, buried in some neglected area of the house? Alternatively, was something else at work? Something seeking to delete their memories, to eradicate those individuals from the planet? Story 14. Living in a little apartment close to Tulane University, perhaps around Broadway St., I was in college in New Orleans, Louisiana. Near my apartment building, an elderly guy with a worn-out guitar and a beautiful voice was a street musician. He usually sang the same song, a terrible tune I had never heard before. I delighted in listening to him perform. Though sad, the music nevertheless seemed oddly consoling. It brought to me simpler times and home. Often sitting on my balcony, I would let the music flood me while he performed. Then, however, something unusual began to happen. I began to find the melody wherever I turned. In the library, coffee shop, on the street, the sad song and melody stayed the same everywhere. I originally saw it as only a coincidence, that the music had stayed in my brain. Still, it began to occur too often for chance. I heard the tune emanating from a neighboring alleyway one day on my way home from class. Looking down the alley, he was there. The street musician. Strumming his guitar, he sang his melancholic tune. I knew, however, he wasn't meant to be there. Miles from where I was currently, he usually played next to my apartment building. My heart thumping in my chest, I moved nearer. The music stopped as I neared. Looking up at me, the street musician had dark, lifeless eyes. He grinned, a slow, eerie smile that chilled my spine. Turning, my head racing, I ran. I kept on running till I arrived at the security of my flat. My body quivering, I shut the door behind me and curled in the corner. I never ran into the street musician once again. Still, I heard the music. The melancholic tune trailed me around, a continual reminder of the uncomfortable meeting in the alleyway. Eventually, wanting to get away from the tune, I left the flat. Still, it trailed me. I sometimes hear it, faint and far off even now, years later, definitely there. A terrible echo of the street musician's song. Story 15. Near Bar Harbor, in a little seaside hamlet in Maine, I was vacationing. I saw a little child playing on the sand one afternoon while I was strolling down the beach, enjoying the sunlight and the clean sea air. She had long black hair and brilliant blue eyes and was around 5 years old. She hummed quietly to herself while she worked on a sandcastle. She had something very familiar. Though I couldn't really put it, I felt pulled to her. Seeking a closer view, I strolled in. The little daughter gazed up at me as I got closer. Her eyes became wide, and she gasped. "Mummy?" she asked softly. In my chest, my heart hammered. She was not her mother. Not even did I have children. Still, the little child resembled me perfectly. It like seeing a younger version of myself. My left cheek has a little birthmark. The same black hair, blue eyes even. My voice shaking, I whispered gently, "I'm not your mummy." The small girl began to weep as her face crumpled. She wept, "Mummy, don't leave me." I dropped down next to her, my head whirling. Not knowing what to do, I felt I couldn't just walk away from her alone and weeping. Still, I was not her mother. I had no idea her name or background. Looking around in search of someone she knew, the beach was almost empty. Though few individuals could be seen in the distance, none appeared to notice the little child or myself. "What's your name?" I begged softly. The little child stared up at me, tears still shining in her eyes. "Lily," she said softly. "Lily," I repeated. "Where is your real mother, Lily?" Lily shook her head. Her sobbing became stronger. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I'm not sure where she is." Hoping to locate someone who could be of assistance, I grabbed Lily's hand and walked her off the shore. As we strolled down the beachfront, we asked merchants and onlookers if they knew a small girl called Lily. None did. I knew I couldn't just keep meandering around with Lily as the sun started to drop. I had to bring her somewhere secure. I resolved to bring her to the neighborhood police station. Lily stopped just as we got to the station. Her eyes wide with dread, she raised her head toward me. "Don't take me there," she said. "They'll sweep me away." I bent down to attempt to soothe her. "It's good, Lily," I said gently. "They'll help us locate your mum." Lily only shook her head, however, tears running down her cheeks. She yelled, "No, I do not want to go." Lily abruptly turned away from me and bolted. She bolted for the shore, vanishes into the approaching gloom. She did not stop when I phoned after her. Running after her, I couldn't locate her. She vanished. Lily never returned. Still, I find myself thinking about her occasionally, about her brilliant blue eyes and her agonizing screams. And I also wonder her name and her background. She was just a missing child? Or was she something different? A phony, a doppelganger, a ghost, a fantasy from my mind? I still find the disturbing likeness haunting me. Now, story 16. My alert clock sounded when I woke up. 6:30 a.m. I turned over, pained, and pressed the snooze button. The same daily ritual I used every morning. Rising from bed, I bathed, changed, and ate breakfast. I walked to the bus station from my Seattle, Washington apartment close to Pike Place Market. The same bus, the same driver, the same folks. I left at my regular station and headed toward my workplace. The same building, the same colleagues, the same assignments. It's Tuesday. Tuesday, exactly usual. Or so I thought. The day progressed and I began to notice oddities. Word for word, conversations I had previously had were occurring once again. Already seen events were happening once again, just as before. Stuck in an infinite cycle. It was like seeing a movie on repeat. At first, I felt as if my mind was playing tricks on me and that I was dreaming. I was also fatigued, but then it was clearly unacceptable to overlook. The same jokes, the same news headlines, the same irritating ringtone from the cubicle mate right next to me. All of this was once more occurring. Anxiety set in. Like a mouse in a labyrinth, I felt imprisoned, compelled to spend the same day over and over again. I sought to disrupt the pattern by changing things. I purchased a different coffee, drove another way to work, and spoke differently in meetings. Not much changed, however. The day proceeded just as previously. By the end of the day, I felt both physically and psychologically tired. Hoping that everything would be back to normal when I woke up, I returned home, snuggled into bed, and closed my eyes. When I woke up, however, it was 6:30 a.m. Tuesday as well. The same alarms clock, the same schedule, the same everything. The repeated day had started once again. How many times I lived through that Tuesday is unknown. Days, weeks, months, probably even years. Time has no importance. I was a prisoner of my own repeated day, caught in an infinite cycle. And I started to question if I would ever be able to leave, or whether I would ever see a Wednesday once again. Story 16. It began with a flickering light. Just a little, almost invisible flutter in my peripheral view. I discounted it as eye strain brought on by too lengthy computer screen viewing. Working from my Brooklyn, New York modest apartment, I was a programmer. Long evenings, plenty of code, that was my life. But the flutter continued. It got more regular, like a defective pixel on a screen. Then came the lag. I would go for my coffee cup, and my hand would appear to stutter mid-air like a missed frame in a video game. The environment in which I live seems fractured. I began to lose things, misplace my keys, forget what I was saying in middle sentence. Noticing this was my girlfriend, Sarah. Concern visible on her face, she questioned one evening, "You okay, Mark?" "You seem off," I murmured, just tired, knowing it was more than that. The planet seemed to be off. Working late one evening, I was fixing a particularly difficult section of code. The flashing was fierce now, almost continuous. Then I noticed it. A line of code, shimmering, off-target. Not the code I had produced. It was different. Looking like a command, one word, render. In my chest, my heart hammered. Rendering like in a game on a video machine? A startling, terrible idea struck me. What if my life wasn't real? Suppose it were all a simulation. I began furiously reading, consuming papers on quantum physics, simulation theory, anything that would help to explain what I was feeling. I became more persuaded the more I knew. The odd programming, the latency, the glitches, all led to one terrible ending. When I attempted to discuss it with Sarah, she only stared pitifully at me. "Mark, you're working too hard," she said softly. "You ought to take a break." Still, I was unable to pause. I was curious. I began searching for further irregularities and supporting data. I discovered them as well. Minor discrepancies, objects that didn't quite fit. A recurring pattern on the wallpaper that ought not to exist. I overheard a talk that appeared contrived, artificial. I saw a guy across the road one day while I was strolling down the street. He had the same hairstyle, wore the same clothing as me, even had a somewhat twisted nose. He had precisely the same appearance as myself. He looked at me. A flutter of identification in his eyes, then disappeared. Just like that. Vanished. I got a chilly fear crawling up my spine. Was he another actor? A system fault? Alternatively, might I be the glitch? I live in continual anxiety now. Every moment seems unstable, as if the world around me may break right now. I'm not sure what is real from what is not. Is Sarah really real? Does this apartment really exist? Is I really real? Alternatively, am I just a ghost in the computer ready to be erased, a series of codes? Now the flashing is much worse. The lag is continuous. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I can hear a tiny murmur just at the edge of hearing. Render. Story 17. I haven't slept well in months. It began gently, a restlessness, a challenge fading off. Then came the sleeplessness. Full-blown, unrelenting. Although my doctor recommended sleeping medications, they just aggravated the dreams. And then the shadows. At first I saw them as just light tricks, the typical phantoms of a sleep-deprived brain, but they become more exact, more substantial. Dark, elongated shadows fluttering in and out of existence lurked in the corners of my chamber. Out of the corner of my eye, I would glimpse them for a moment, then they would vanish. Specifically Burlington, I live in a small, peaceful town in Vermont. My home is ancient with drafty windows and creaky flooring. I reminded myself the house was settling, the wind playing games. Still, the shadows followed. They began to engage in actual world interaction. I discovered a book on the ground after waking one morning. It was on my nightstand the evening before. I grabbed it. A shiver coursed down my spine. Just before I fell down, I could have swore I had seen one of the shadows close by. Another time, apparently on its own, a glass of water on my desk toppled over. I was across the room and nothing explained the lack of draft or vibration. But I saw it, a brief glimpse of a black man withdrawing into the shadows as the glass dropped. They began to be more audacious. My clothing were all over the floor when I woke up and my furniture was changed. One morning I discovered a single word, probably soot, scribbled on my bathroom mirror. I attempted to inform others, friends, relatives, but they simply gave me worried looks. "You ought to sleep, John," they would advise. "You're imagining things." But I was not seeing it. Knowing I wasn't was something else. They really were real. Real and more invasive were these shadow persons and creatures. That last night was the worst. Fear paralyzing me, I was laying in bed watching one of the shadows separate from the wall. It slid across the room toward me, its shape become more definite and apparent. It had long, wiry fingers and was tall and quite skeleton. Its frigid presence seemed like a terrible void sucking the oxygen from my lungs. It extended its dark hand toward my face. Then nothing. I screamed, a quiet scream caught in my throat. I passed blackouts. This morning I woke up and the light was flowing through my window. Everything seemed to be in line. Still, I know they are there, stalking me from the shadows, anticipating. I feel them, and I know with a terrible clarity they are not going away. They will be here forever. I also have no idea what they want for. Story 18. I am San Francisco, California therapist Dr. Eleanor Vance. My area of expertise is delusional diseases, and I have encountered some rather strange instances. Nothing, however, readied me for Mr. David Walker. Mid-20s, David was a young guy with a serious Cotard's delusion, the conviction he was dead. He felt he was a walking corpse, that his body was rotting. He seldom talked, skipped meals, and spent much of his sessions just looking at the wall. His voice raspy and feeble, he would say, "I'm already gone, doctor. There is nothing left of me. I gave it all. Medication, counseling, even some experimental therapies. Nothing appeared to be working. His dream was unquestionable. And suddenly things began to seem somewhat unusual. Particularly during David's sessions, my office's air got substantially cooler. The plants in my office began to wither, their leaves brittle and dark. I began to smell something faintly like decaying. I first discounted it. Stress, I reminded myself. The extended hours and challenging cases. Still, the alterations persisted. Like mold, the walls off. My workplace began to show black, creeping stains. Still, it wasn't mold. It resembled more of rotting. One day, during a David session, I saw a fly hovering above his head. Another then, still another. The room was buzzing with flies. They landed on his skin. He seemed not to see. He just sat there, blankly ahead, murmuring about his own disintegration. "They can smell it, doctor," he said, a little grin playing on his lips. "They are aware I am dead." Growing discomfort in my gut, I batted the flies off. This is not usual. This was still something else. When I got to my workplace the next day, the stink was intolerable. Entire portions of the wallpaper had been consumed by the spreading deterioration on the walls. Dead, withered husks were the vegetation, and the air, like a morgue, was icy. I hurried into David's room. Though he was seated in his regular chair, he appeared different. His skin was almost colorless, pallid, his eyes buried behind black circles. He struck me as a corpse. His voice almost audible, he said, "It's happening, doctor. I'm finally gone." He then slung over in his chair, quiet and silent. My hands shaking, I phoned. Arriving, the paramedics checked his pulse and then turned to face me with austere attitudes. Dead was his state. Natural causes, heart failure, was the coroner's reported cause of death. I knew better, however. David's hallucination had not just crept into his thoughts. It was now actual. He had wished himself to die, and in doing this, he had turned my workplace into a grave, a sobering monument to the might of the human mind. I now sit across town in a different workplace. The plants are brilliant and green, the walls are just painted. But I can't get rid of the terrible conviction that David's hallucination is still out there, someplace, ready to seize hold in another naive mind. And sometimes late at night, when I'm with myself in my office, I think I can hear the whispering walls repeating David's last words, "I'm finally gone." Story 19. It began with a fantasy about spiders. Thousands of them crawling all over me, their fangs burrowing into my body and their hairy legs tickling my skin. Screaming, sweating, my heart thumping, I woke up. I wrote it off as just a horrible dream, but then it happened. Small red welts all over my body woke me up the next morning. They looked just like spider bites and itched like crazy. When I visited the doctor, he advised me that most likely an allergic response to anything was involved. He handed me some lotion and the welts vanished finally. The dreams, nevertheless, persisted. Every night the dreams became more vivid and more terrible. I dreamed of drowning in dark, muddy water, of falling from tremendous heights, of being pursued by shadowless beings. And every morning I would awaken to see the dreams materializing in front of me. My ankle sprained when I woke up after the falling dream. Long scratch marks down my back followed the chase dream, and woke up gasping for oxygen, my lungs burning, as though I had really been underwater after the drowning dream. I share a little Phoenix, Arizona apartment. Mostly senior occupants, this is a calm building. I looked for logical answers, attempted to make sense of it. The ankle that has been twisted, I had to trip. The cuts, the cat down the hall has to have entered my flat. The coughing issues? Perhaps just a hint of asthma. Deeply yet, I knew the truth. My aspirations were being realized. The nightmares alone. I started to get panic about sleep. I would remain late viewing TV, reading, anything to keep my eyes up rather than shutting them. Eventually, however, tiredness would overwhelm, and I would drop asleep only to be thrown back into the horrific world of my dreams. One evening I dreamed of flames. Flames licking at the walls, smoke filling my lungs. I was imprisoned in my flat. I woke up coughing and smelled strongly of smoke. My heart thumping, I staggered from bed and saw it. A little fire blazing in the corner of my living room. It had begun exactly where it had been in my dream. Shaking with terror, I managed to put it out. This was no longer a coincidence now. This was something else, something horrible. I'm terrified to sleep now. I am aware that the dreams will resurface if I shut my eyes. And I have no idea what they could bring next. I have a therapist now, but she only tells me it is stress and worry. She disagrees with me. None of anybody does. But the reality is what I know. I'm a prisoner of my own brain, caught in a loop of nightmares, and I have no idea where I could flee. I just lay awake at night, waiting for the next dream to start while listening to quiet. Looking forward the next nightmare to materialize. Story 20. It began as a quiet hum, a subtle buzz in the backdrop of my ideas. I discounted it as tinnitus, the buzzing in the ears my doctor had cautioned me about. Surrounded by books, I have a calm career as a librarian in Chicago, Illinois. Usually the stillness was a relief, but the buzz got louder, more forceful. I next began to hear voices, Initially whispers, brief exchanges, bits of ideas. I believed I was going insane. I returned to the doctor to have a battery of tests done. All returned as usual. He wrote me prescriptions for anti-anxiety drugs, but they had no effect. The voices sharpened and became louder. I understood what was occurring slowly and horrifically. I could hear opinions of others, everyone's ideas, inner monologues, the stream of consciousness, unacknowledged needs, worries and anxieties of everyone around me constantly overwhelmed me. It was overpowering. The supermarket became a torture chamber. The cashier's critical comments on my cereal selection, the elderly lady behind me grumbling about the lengthy lines, the young couple privately debating their money. It was a symphony of inner voices, a continual sensory assault. My formerly quiet library turned become a battleground of contradicting ideas. The kids worried about their tests, the researchers fixated on their work, the homeless guy in the corner dreaming of a hot lunch. It was overabundance. Though it was difficult, I attempted to tune everything out and concentrate on my own ideas. The voices were always there, an inevitable buzz. I began using noise-cancelling headphones, earplugs, anything to help to reduce the noise. Nevertheless, it didn't work. The ideas invaded everything, a constant assault on my right to solitude. My connections broke apart. When I knew precisely what someone else was thinking, how could I approach a conversation? The courteous falsehoods, the suppressed grudges, the unstated assessments, it made intimacy unworkable. Lisa, my girlfriend, walked away from me. "You're distant, Michael," she observed with a mournful tone. "You're not present." I could not be honest with her. She would not agree with me. Nobody would. I began locking myself in my apartment, avoiding social events. The only haven where the voices failed to reach me was stillness. Still, the buzzing lingered, a continual reminder of the turmoil within. I am about to break. The continuous loudness, the unrelenting encroachment, it is driving me crazy. I hardly function, I cannot eat, and I cannot sleep. I am imprisoned in my own head, in a prison of other people's ideas. How much longer I could be able to handle? The voices grew louder and more forceful. They are beginning to mix, a whirlpool of ideas, feelings and needs. I can feel myself slinking away from control. What happens when I at last snap worries me. What I could do scares me. Sometimes late at night when the city is still, I can hear one distinct clear voice above the others, whispering a single terrible word, silence. It is my own voice. Story 21. Art has always captivated me. The vivid colors, the expressive brushwork, the way a painting may capture a moment, a mood, a tale. Although I am not a very gifted artist myself, I value the ability, commitment and passion involved in producing a piece of art. Paintings, usually landscapes and still lifes, gathered from local galleries and flea markets, abound in my little Santa Fe, New Mexico apartment. They calm me of serenity and quiet, up till lately. It began with a little painting, a still life of a bowl of fruit. I paid a couple bucks at a garage sale. It was simply a basic, pleasing picture, nothing particularly unique. Still, I saw something strange one day. The apple in the dish seemed to have slid somewhat. I laughed it off as my imagination, the light playing games on my eyes. The fruit had shifted once again, however, the next day. There was absolutely no question this time. It was in a totally other posture. I watched the painting avidly at first, hoping to capture anything moving. The fruit, I put up a concealed camera. The camera, however, never recorded anything. The camera would display only a still picture, while the fruit would vary, the colors would alter slightly, the shadows would extend and shorter. The other paintings began to vary then, The scenes would change. The trees would swing in a non-existent wind. The clouds would float over the heavens. The still lifes would come alive. The things reorganizing themselves, the flowers flowering and withering. The paintings seemed to have a life of their own, a secret universe tucked away on the canvas. I gradually, shockingly came to see the reality. The paintings were beginning to live. Only while none was looking, however. People, friends, relatives, I attempted to tell, but they just laughed. "You have been spending too much time alone painting," they would remark. "You ought to get outside more." Still, I knew what I was seeing. I understood it to be genuine. I began experimenting, left the room for brief intervals, then hurried returning to see what had changed. The modifications become more extreme, more unsettling. I walked out of the room for 1 hour one day. The fruit still life had changed when I got back. The dish was fractured, the fruit had gone bad, and flies swirled about the crumbling picture. The scent was quite overbearing and sickeningly sweet. I also left the room overnight another occasion. The sight in the landscape painting had become horrific when I got back. Shadowy creatures lurked in the foreground, the sky was a whirl of dark clouds, the trees were twisted and gnarled. A chilly fear started to slink up my spine.
I am now reluctant to leave my flat. When I'm not here to see the paintings, I have no idea what will happen to them.
I am prisoner of the secret of the canvas, caught in a gallery of my own creation, spending my days observing the paintings. I attempt to predict their next action and decipher their secret universe. And sometimes, late at night when the flat is empty, I imagine I can hear the faint whisper of brushstrokes, the rustling of leaves, the buzzing of insects, originating from the canvases around me. They are awaiting, viewing, and I have no idea what their next move will be. Story 22. Living in an Austin, Texas calm suburb, I am a novelist and writer. My days are spent creating worlds, developing tales, giving characters life. Though I live alone, I adore my life, at least in theory. Dark fantasy with rich characters and sophisticated plot lines makes up my most recent book, The City of Whispers. Spending months carefully developing the universe, I put my heart and soul into it, giving the characters life. My greatest effort so far, and I felt good about it. Still, they began to show up. First, sleep-tired from the late evenings of writing, I felt I was having hallucinations. Out of the corner of my eye, I would see brief figures that matched the characters in my novel. Towering and forceful warrior with a scarred face, a fascinating sorceress with flowing black robes, a cheeky imp with brilliant red eyes. They were merely there. In my flat, in the grocery shop on the street, always alert. Then they began chatting to me. The warrior complained, his voice loud and resonant. "This isn't how it's supposed to happen. You have altered the narrative. My motivations are far more complicated than you have shown," the sorceress growled, her eyes blazing. "More pranks. You have to start doing more pranks," the imp cried. Hopping around my living room, they were moaning about their discourse, requesting revisions to their narrative, debating their intentions. Things were anarchy. My fictitious works now had actual form, and they were unhappy as well. I tried to ignore them, to discount them as products of my mind. Still they persisted, becoming ever more forceful. They began interacting with the actual environment, moving items, breaking off chats, even resulting in little mishaps. "You are destroying everything." The warrior screamed and slammed his fist on my desk, sending papers all over. The sorceress grumbled, tossing a book across the room. "My character arc is totally flawed." "Where's the fun? Where is the anarchy?" the imp corrected. burning a stack of newspapers. My life now is a nightmare. Living in a world blurring the boundaries between fiction and reality, my own characters bother me regularly. I have tried giving them what they want and altering the narrative, but it is never sufficient. They are continually seeking more. Trapped in a feedback cycle of my own design, I am a prisoner of the ink bleeding off the page. How should I stop them? I have no idea how to get them vanish. Right now, they are a component of my life, and I worry they will be here forever. The warrior rounded me in my kitchen last night. With his hand, he clutched a shining blade whose tip rested at my breast. "You have one final opportunity," he hissed. "Reword the conclusion. Alternatively, face the fallout." Right now, I'm sitting here looking at a blank page and the cursor is flashing mockingly. I have nothing to write about. How one may exit this dream is unknown. The voices became louder as the ink bled. Story 23. Time is an odd concept. From history to present to the future, we see it as a straight march ahead. But if we could then, if we could go back and erase our errors, experience our victories, I could. Still, at a horrible cost. It started gently. I would lose my keys, then all of a sudden they would be back in my grasp. A hazy sensation of déjà vu flooding me. Mid-sentence, I would stutter over a word, then the phrase would exactly repeat, as if I had changed it in real time. Outside of Boise, Idaho, in a little town I reside, here life is leisurely and predictable. It was, alternatively. The larger things began to happen then. I would argue with Martha, my wife, using angry words and remorse accumulating. Then all of a sudden I would be back a few minutes sooner, the dispute cleared, a fresh start. Making a poor judgment at work would cost my business money and cause my boss to get enraged. Then, poof, I would be back at my desk, the error corrected, the choice reversed. I came to see I was reversing time. Not in a broad, all-encompassing sense, but in little increments, like remote control rewind button action. It was thrilling at first. A second shot, a do-over, an opportunity to make every moment great. I avoided mishaps, excelled in presentations, won debates. Life turned into a game, a precisely coordinated performance. Still, the holes began to show up, little things at beginning. I would forget where I had parked my vehicle, mix names of friends, find it difficult to remember what I had for supper the evening before. The larger recollections began to disappear then. Early years, my wedding day, the birth of Sarah, my daughter, they become foggy and fuzzy, like fading pictures. Tea frightened, I visited the doctor. He scanned, did tests, handled everything. He stated it was tension and anxiousness. He gave prescriptions for drugs. It made no difference. The gaps widened, descended deeper, absorbing ever more of my history. I came to see the awful reality. Every rewind, every fix, every ideal moment cost something. One bit of my recollection, a sloshful of my identity, was disappearing. I was sacrificing a perfect present for my past. I live in continual terror now. Anxiety about losing myself and about forgetting. I try not to rewind, to embrace the flaws, the errors, the regrets. Nevertheless, it's difficult. There is always temptation. The appeal of a perfect moment, a faultless existence, is irresistible. I had a horrible quarrel with Martha last night. Words were said, nasty, horrible words. I felt the old tug, the need to turn back to rectify the harm. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, then resisted. I let the moment remain, the hurt, the guilt, the flaw. I woke up this morning and forgot what the debate was about. I turned to Martha, her sorrowful expression clearly visible. and felt a tsunami of panic. She vanished from memory. Story 24. It started rather innocuously. One Tuesday, I got up, had breakfast, left for the hardware store in Portland, Maine, returned home, watched some TV, and went to bed. An exactly normal day. I got up once more then. Tuesday is it, once more. I initially felt as if I was just experiencing a strange déjà vu. Still, I became aware of the specifics later. My nightstand's chipped mug is the same. The same robin chirping just outside my window. Radio is playing the same news item. Tuesday was just precisely like yesterday. Expecting something new, some departure from the script, I headed to work. But everything was exactly the same. The same clients, the same complaints, the same bad break room coffee. Our regular, Mr. Henderson, arrived exactly at 10:15 a.m. and requested the same odd bolt he had requested yesterday. Like yesterday, my colleague Sarah spilled her coffee precisely at 2:37 p.m. A rising discomfort in my gut, I headed home. I ate supper, watched the same TV programs, and went to bed at the same hour. And then I got up. Tuesday, once more. Day after day the cycle went on, an infinite loop of the same Tuesday. The same dialogues, the same procedures, the same boring details repeated ad nausea. I worked to stop the cycle. I got a new coffee, changed my route to work, attempted striking up a conversation with a total stranger. Nothing produced. The day would reset and I would be back at the start, caught in my own Groundhog Day. The really horrible aspect was that everyone else was blind. They grew old, changed, lived their lives. I stayed caught in this Tuesday always. While I stayed the same, caught in this temporal loop, my colleague Sarah became engaged, then married, then pregnant within a few weeks. While I stayed fixed, a static figure in a changing world, Mr. Henderson's hair got thinner, his movements slowed, his voice weaker. People just looked at me with sympathy as I attempted to explain what was occurring. "You're working too hard, David," they would counsel. "You ought to have a vacation." Still, there was no way out, no vacation from this Tuesday that is reoccurring. Alone in this cycle, a prisoner of time, I watched the world change without me. I began exploring outside of my Tuesday jail. I attempted to end it all, disclose my darkest secrets, even engaged in small-time offenses. Nothing produced. The day would start again, and I would be back at the beginning, the slate pristine. I merely exist now. I go through the motions, repeating the same behaviors, the same dialogues, the same schedules. I stay fixed in time as the world ages around me. In my own existence, I am a ghost seeing a world going on without me, and I have no idea where I could flee. Not sure if I will ever do. I am only waiting until Wednesday, a Wednesday never to be had. Story 25. I woke up in Rochester, New York, in a hospital bed, without recall of who I was or how I got there. The physicians informed me I had sustained a serious brain injury in an automobile accident. They said my amnesia was transient and my memories would come back gradually. They never did. Based on the license from my wallet, they referred to me as John. John Evans. Examining the picture on the license, I saw a nice guy with kind eyes and a friendly grin. Like a face I had seen in a dream, it seemed familiar, yet far off. After being discharged from the hospital and taken home to a lovely suburban house, Emily, a loving wife, and 2 gorgeous boys and a girl. Relieved to have me back, they greeted me with open arms, but I felt like an actress performing a part in a play I hadn't practiced. An imposter. Emily bombarded me with specifics about my life. Working at a reputable company downtown, I was a successful attorney. I had a tight group of friends, a satisfying profession, a contented family. It sounded fantastic. Still, none of it seemed genuine. None of it spoke to me. I attempted to blend in, to pass for John Evans, the successful attorney and devoted husband and father. But the more I tried, the more I felt the distance separating the life I was leading from the person I believed I was. The fractures first began to show. Names, dates, significant events I would overlook. Driving a vehicle or presenting a case in court would be chores that should have come naturally, but I would struggle to do. Emily noticed. One evening she murmured, "You're different, John," her voice tinged with worry. "You have changed ever since the accident." I could not tell her the truth. I was ignorant of the truth, not even sure my name was. Then I came across it. A secret box stashed at the rear of my closet. Inside were messages, pictures, and notebooks. Their owner belonged to another guy. One individual by name is Daniel. The diaries covered his life, his aspirations, his secrets, his anxieties, and reading them made me realize something rather terrifying. John Evans was not me. I identified as Daniel, and I was inhabiting the life of another. Amnesia had not resulted from the vehicle crash. It had brought about a trade. My psyche, my individuality, had somehow found expression in John Evans's body. Living his life with his family, in his home surrounded with memories, was me. Still, these were not my recollections. His were them, and I became caught within them. I live in continual terror now. Anxiety of being found, anxiety of losing this borrowed existence, anxiety of never knowing who I really am. I glance at Emily, at my kids, and I start to feel guilty, sad. They need me and they adore me, but my spouse is not their father either. Living a falsehood. I am a stranger and a fraudster. What to do is unknown to me. I should be honest with them. Search for my own life and identity then. Alternatively, until the day the real John Evans comes back, should I keep living this borrowed life, this stolen existence? Trapped in a life not mine, I am a prisoner of memories from another person. I also have no idea how I may flee. Story 26th. Detective Miles Corbin from the NYPD here. Over years on the police, I have seen a lot. Violence, treachery, hopelessness. It covers the area. But in this instance, this is different. I find it disturbing. Its beginning was with a body. Found in her Upper West Side apartment, a young lady killed rather violently. The MO was nearly surgical, exact, uncommon. Nor forceful entrance, nor evidence of fight, simply death. One serious cut to the chest, then still another body. Same MO, still another young lady, another single, exact wound. The city was poised on edge. Press called the murderer the surgeon. There was great strain on catching him. Working long hours, following leads, questioning witnesses, I immersed myself into the inquiry. I was increasingly unsettled the more I knew. The murderer was exacting, leaving no DNA, no fingerprints, no trace evidence. Moving around the city invisible and unheard, he was a ghost, a phantom. The third victim arrived at last, and this time around, I discovered something. On the door frame, close to the latch, a little, almost invisible scrape. Though hardly obvious, it was there. I grabbed a sample, sent it to the lab. The answers arrived 1 week later. DNA match, my genetic makeup, my blood ran cold. It isn't possible. There has to be a flaw. Naturally, my DNA would be at the murder scene. I had been there. The lab verified it, however. The DNA on the door frame fit exactly. Neither contamination nor cross-contamination. My blood is what it is. I began doubting everything. My moves, my memories, my sanity. I hadn't been sleeping, hence my entire awake consciousness was consumed. Blacked out then? Had I done without thinking about it? The dreams began, strong, horrific nightmares of blood, of screaming, of the cold, dead eyes of the victims looking up at me. My heart thumping, I woke up in a chilly sweatshirt and the pictures burned into my head. Afraid of what I may see, I began avoiding mirrors. Terrified of the monster hiding under the surface, the murderer was right front view. I began drinking excessively, attempting to dull the guilt, the terror, the mounting sense that I was the same monster I was pursuing. The evidence against me began to mount up. Little things at beginning. One missing knife from my kitchen drawer-through. One bloodstain on my shirt eluded me in explanation. One witness claimed to have seen me close to the apartment of the third victim the evening of the murder. I am imprisoned, captured in a site I created. I hunt, I am the hunted. The murderer is me, the detective is myself, and I have no idea where I could flee. I have no idea how I may stop myself. The hunter's shadow hangs over the streets, waiting for the next victim while the city sleeps. Not far away, story 27. When her death came, my grandma handed me her old mirror, beautifully detailed with a silver frame and a somewhat tarnished surface. It was extravagant. For as long as I could remember, it hung in her doorway, silently observing family events, holidays, and daily life. As a link to the past and a memento of her, I put it in my Charleston, South Carolina bedroom. I ought to have dumped it in the attic. It was originally just a mirror. My own visage reflected back at me, somewhat worn out, slightly strained, but normal. I then began to find minute variations. A somewhat different outfit, a different haircut, a different attitude. I discounted it as my imagination, the playfulness of the light, the way a mirror may skew reality. Still, the variations grew increasingly noticeable. I would get up with a different hairstyle from the one I slept with. I discovered items in my closet that I had forgotten purchasing. My flat would be reconfigured, furnishings changed, decorations relocated. Little things that might be easily justified, yet the discomfort mounted. Then came the more significant alterations. At work, I got a promotion for which I had not applied. Anna, my girlfriend, broke off with me stating illogical reasons. I discovered that I had no interest in a pottery class and thus registered in one. An invisible power was gently changing, controlling my life. I began fixatively staring in the mirror. I would spend hours looking at my mirror, attempting to catch it in the act and make sense of what was occurring. One evening then, I spotted it. My thinking turned around. My blood was frigid. Not me was the image in the mirror. It was something different, something evil, something autonomous. It was regulating my life, changing it, gently modifying my reality. It didn't work when I attempted wrapping the mirror with a sheet. The transformations persisted. I tried getting it out of my apartment and down to the basement, but it would come back in my bedroom the following morning as if it had will of its own. I find myself imprisoned, a prisoner in my own life under the direction of my reflection, under the creature caught in the view of the mirror. Now I see it in little flashes. A flutter of movement at the periphery of my vision, a little change in the mirror, a cold, calculated grin playing on the lips of the face that ought to be mine. I have no idea what it seeks. Why choose me? I know I have to quit, however. Before it's too late, I have to discover a means of escaping its grasp and recovering my life. Before the contemplation swallows me totally. Before I became it. Story 28, I found I could pass through other people's brains. More like a slip, a stumble into their inner world. It was not a deliberate choice. First, it occurred in Des Moines, Iowa, with my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. I was tending to my plants on the balcony when I felt her ideas, memories, emotions all around. The great loss of her spouse, the peaceful delight of caring for her garden, the boiling hatred against her loud upstairs neighbor, me. It was a rush, a vertigo of sensory data. Then I was back in my own thoughts, startled yet fascinated just as abruptly. It began to occur more often. A touch, a gaze, a shared moment, I would be inside their thoughts, seeing their world from their vantage point. The bus driver, the coffee shop barista, the guy homeless on the corner, every mind is individual cosmos, a fabric of ideas, feelings, and experiences. It originally seemed intriguing. A window into the secret life of others, an opportunity to grasp their goals, their worries, their aspirations. I connected, felt sympathetic, something I had never done before. Still, the price became evident at last. Every time I entered a mind, I would lose some little of myself. A memory, a personality quality, a slivers of my identity. At first, it was subtle. A forgotten name, a lost object, a transient feeling of emptiness. But the holes widened, sank more and more of who I was into. I attempted to halt, fight the draw of other people's thoughts. But it was more like an addiction, a need for connection, for knowledge, for something more. I started to take bits of other people to cover the widening hole in myself. The planet started to blur faces, sounds, ideas. I could not hang on to my own memories or identity. Like a chameleon adjusting to every new intellect, every new personality, every new existence, I was losing myself among the maze of other people's ideas. My own thoughts turned into strangers. The visage in the mirror moved, altered, twisted, mirroring the bits of the brains I had traversed. Mrs. Henderson's anguish, the barista's anxiousness, a ghost of the homeless man's hopelessness flickering through her. My own identity was disintegrating, split, dispersed across the brains I had penetrated. I am terrified to touch, look at, connect now. Haunted by losing the final traces of who I am, I withdraw and hide in my flat. Still, the yearning for connection persists, the gnawing emptiness. And I know with a terrifying clarity that I will slip once again, trip into another mind, pilfers another piece, loses another part of myself, until nothing remains, until I am only a hollow echo of the thoughts I have ingested. Story 29. My great-aunt Matilda was quirky. Living in a sprawling Victorian mansion in Savannah, Georgia, she had odd antiquities and dusty relics. Her most valuable item left for me when Mom died was an old mirror. With a black, almost obsidian surface and a hefty, ornate frame, it was a startling work. Not knowing what to do with it, I put it largely forgotten in my spare room. Until that one evening, a chilly draft, a freezing breeze seemed to come from the spare room awakened me. Rising slowly, I opened the door and saw it. The mirror shone, a weak, ghostly light coming from its surface. Drawn by an invisible power, I went toward it and peered into its depths. Not my reflection back at me, it was yet another universe, a warped, deformed form of my own. Shadows swept over the streets, the sky was a sickening green, the trees were skeletal and naked. It seemed like peering into a dream. As if the mirror were liquid, I touched the surface with my fingertips sinking into the frigid glass. I felt a pull, a suction, dragging me into the world mirrored back. My heart thumping in my chest, I drew back. It really was. Real, this other world, this twisted reality. And it was striving for breakthrough. The images become more frequent and intense during the following several evenings. The mirror would radiate, the other world would call, and I would find myself pulled to its icy embrace. I began to notice lights of the other world seeping into my own. A flutter of green in the heavens, a twisted shadow in the corner of my eye, a brief view of a dark man vanishing around a corner. I tried covering the mirror, boarding it, even hammering it apart. Nothing had any effect. The images persisted, the bleeding became worse. The other universe was gradually, inexorably eating everything in its path into my reality. My apartment began to look different. The furniture twisted, the walls bent, the air got frigid and stifling. Strange alien fungus took place of the dying and shriveled vegetation. The murmurs and groans of the other realm took front stage in the noises of the metropolis beyond. I find myself caught. A prisoner in my own house, because the bleeding glass gradually absorbs my reality. Now I see them, the dark shapes prowling the corners of my room, their eyes ablaze with a cold, terrible glow. They're waiting, seeing, and I know, rather definitely, that they are approaching me. They are dragging me into their universe, into the dreams seen on the bleeding glass. Story 30. Currently employed in a tiny lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I am Dr. Evelyn Reed, a sleep researcher. Dreams, that odd, bizarre terrain of the subconscious, have always captivated me. I committed my life to deciphering their mysteries. I created a gadget, a breakthrough piece of technology, able to capture dreams and convert brain electrical impulses into visual and audible signals. It was revolutionary, a game changer, till it wasn't. The first several experiments turned out well. Volunteers would sleep, link to the gadget, and I would note their dreams and playback them the next morning. Mostly mundane things, flights of imagination, worries, suppressed needs, typical dream fodder here. Then things changed. One of my helpers, a young college student called Sarah, dreamed of a vehicle crash. Red automobile driving along a road covered in rain runs into a blue truck. The particulars were vivid and unsettling. I dismissed it as just a dream, till the next day. I saw it while driving home from the lab. Red automobile driving along a road covered in rain runs into a blue truck. The very same make and model, the same street intersection, the same terrible impact. Sarah's fantasy was playing out in actual life. Heart hammering in my chest, I hurried to the scene. Fortunately, not significantly, the drivers were harmed. Still, the shock, the terrible insight stuck with me. The dream recorder has not just noted a dream, it had recorded the next world. I conducted further experiments, more trials with various people. The outcomes came out the same. The gadget was timing events before they occurred. One fortunate person won the lottery, a fire in a neighboring apartment complex, a robbery at a close convenience shop. The dreams were becoming into precognitive flashes into the future, performed in the sleeping brains of my subjects. The ramifications were astonishing and horrible. I could foretell the future. Still, at what price? The dreams became darker and more disruptive. Global pandemics, natural calamities, terrorist strikes. The future the recorder was showing me was a horror. It was too late. I attempted to shut down the project and destroy the gadget. My everyday existence was bleeding the precognitive dreams. I would see flashes of future events, fragments of approaching calamities, playing out on the margins of my view. Living in an ongoing state of anxiety, I was a prisoner of the future. Now I sit in my lab watching the future play on the monitors, surrounded by the dream recorders, buzzing equipment, and flashing lights. Consumed by fire, floods, conflict, I see the earth dying. And I cannot stop it. Only helplessly can I watch as the precognitive recorder performs the last deed of mankind.